Okay, we're going to talk today about implicit bias. I'm pretty informal in my training, so if you have a question, unmute your phone, *6, ask it, or if you want to type it in the conversation bar, you can do that as well. And, we'll take questions as they come up. I don't have a problem with that. So when we talk about implicit bias, there's been a lot of focus on it, particularly in the past 15 years. What we're talking about is things that we're not typically aware of. So if you have ever found yourself in a situation where you think maybe that overweight person shouldn't be eating that dessert, or you're walking past a young male of a different race at night and you adjust your posture or your walking speed, you may not even realize that you're doing that. But that comes from that implicit bias. So that's what we're going to talk about, and how it can impact in the workplace. So Mazarin Banaji has written a lot of papers on it, but I really liked this portion that he wrote here. He says, most of us believe that we're ethical and unbiased. We imagine we're good decision makers, able to objectively size up a job candidate or a venture deal and reach a fair and rational conclusion that's in our and our organization's best interest. But more than 2 decades of research confirms that in reality, most of us fall woefully short of our inflated self-perception. And I think that just sort of hits the nail on the head about what we're going to discuss today. So when we talk about bias, there's two. There's explicit bias and implicit. We're going to deal with implicit. Explicit is expressed directly. You're aware you have the bias. It operates consciously in you. And an example would be like if you said, I like white people more than Latinos. Implicit bias is trickier. It's expressed indirectly. You're unaware of the bias. It operates subconsciously in your brain. And the example would be you walk into a room and there's a table available next to maybe a Latino or a white person, and you're white, and you go sit by the white person. And you may not even realize you've done that. And a lot of times when I attend meetings and stuff, I look around the room and you still see that happening. People still go sit by people that look most like themselves. And it's kind of interesting. And if you would ask a room full of people, did you consciously make a decision to sit away from someone who's different from you? They would tell you, no, I didn't. But that's that implicit bias within us. So what is implicit bias? It resides deep in our subconscious, okay? These biases are different from our known biases that we may choose to conceal for the purpose of social or political correctness. But implicit biases are not accessible through our introspection. So it refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, our decisions in an unconscious manner. And those biases can include favorable and unfavorable assessments. They're activated involuntarily and without our awareness or control. So some of the characteristics of implicit bias, they're pervasive. Everyone possesses them. Even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, maybe a judge. Implicit and explicit biases are related, but they're distinct mental constructs. They're not mutually exclusive, and they may even reinforce each other. Implicit associations we hold don't necessarily align with what we declare our beliefs to be. We generally tend to hold them to favor our own in-group, and they're malleable. Our brain is incredibly complex, and the implicit associations that we have formed can be gradually unlearned through a variety of de-biasing techniques, and we'll talk about those and how certain actions you can take can counteract the implicit biases that we all have. So how we make decisions. Our brain makes decisions in two ways. One is we carefully consider. We are conscious in analyzing, making a decision, and that could be something like, I'm going to buy a car, and so I'm, researching, and I want to do this, I want to do that, I know what color I want, I know what I want, I've thought that through. Intuitively is that gut reaction is the unconscious. That's where if you're walking through the woods, you come across a snake, I'm going to say that 99% of us do not stop and analyze, is that snake poisonous or non-poisonous? Is that snake going to harm me or not? I think our immediate gut reaction is what? To leave. Back up, give that space, snake his space that he needs. Now, my husband would be the person who would tell you, you look at the head, and if it's shaped a certain way, that snake is not going to bother you. I'm not going to stick around and figure out if that snake is going to bother me or not. I'm moving. That's that fight or flight. It goes back to the prehistoric era, our Neanderthal brains, where that's how we survived, that gut instinct. So our brains continue to strive to minimize threats to our survival by following the path of least resistance. It scans conditions, it does confirmation, maintains comfort, and this is the source of our stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. We are not aware that it's doing that, but it is constantly doing that for us, and making decisions and taking the path of least resistance to do that. So there's a 5% rule, and there's a humorous story about this 5% rule. But 95% of what we tell you is true, we have never seen. We think it's true based on the 5% we have seen. We make an assumption. Our brain makes the assumptions where we don't have all the information. Harold Myers, we have a colleague who put this quote in one of his slideshows, and everybody loved it, so they started using it. But nobody knew who Harold Myers was, and it turned out that Harold Myers was like his high school algebra teacher. So Kansas high school, Harold Myers math teacher is like across the country now, and he may not even be aware. But what is the first 5% we notice about the people we meet? If you walk into a room or someone comes into your office and maybe they use a wheelchair, what is your brain processing? What is going on? You're not sitting there and making a conscious assessment, but your brain is. And it has an effect on our perception of people. So our brain, in the absence of familiarity, we revert to the stereotypes in our brain, positive or negative. Now, I'm not overly thrilled with the term positive or negative stereotype, because I think all stereotypes are not, positive or negative. They're just not appropriate. But in terms of a positive attribute, let me give you an example. So you may have a bias and not realize it, that you think maybe all Asians are excellent at math. Certainly not true. That would be considered a positive attribute, okay? So that's what our brain is doing. In the absence of familiarity with someone, our brain is scanning and will grab onto those stereotypes associated that are within us and, set the tone for the rest of our interactions with that person. So look at these words for a minute. And if you're not where you can see it, sorry. So when you look at that, you probably saw the cat. But in reality, it isn't the cat, it's T-H-E-C-H-T. Our brain just filled that in. We made that H in the word cat an A. Nobody ever looks at it and says, the chit, So that's our brain filling in where we're not aware and we have maybe ambiguous information. That's what happens. So how strong is implicit bias? You've all seen this. You've seen this optical illusion, right? Which line is shorter? And our brain wants to say A, okay? How can that be? Our logical brains tell us those two lines are identical in length, but when we look at them, do they still look identical? No, they don't. So even when our logical brains tell us something is true, our intuitive brains don't buy it. So we know that those two lines are exactly the same, but our brain still isn't buying that, because when you look at it, you're still saying A is shorter, B is longer. So let's talk about where these biases come from. And your brain absorbs messaging, your brain absorbs its environment, where you went to school, your family, your faith, the town you live in, what part of the country you grew up with, what you read, what kind of TV, radio, whatever, you were exposed to is where those biases arise from. So I'd like to look a little bit at some of the bias that appears in media, and I just have a couple examples. So back in 1998 at the Winter Olympics, the U.S. figure skating team consisted of Tara Lipinski and Michelle Kwan and others, okay? So Lipinski won the gold medal in figure skating, and her teammate Michelle Kwan won the silver medal. MSNBC put the headline, along with the picture, "American beats Kwan." They're both American. They were both born in America. But they made the assumption that because Michelle Kwan's last name sounded Asian, that she was not American. They got a lot of feedback on that. So let's look at this. This newspaper in Iowa, the Gazette, posted 2 stories about local burglaries written by the same author and published within 1 day of each other. Okay? One story used yearbook photos of the suspects, which is the 3 white men on the left there, and the other used mugshots, which is the 4 African-American men. And it was the same thing. They both sets of gentlemen were accused of burglary. When they were asked about it, the newspaper said that they had to make a formal request in order to get mugshots, okay? So they didn't have mugshots for the 3 wrestlers from the college team, but yet they were clearly willing to take that extra step when it came to the black suspects. They were fine making a formal request to get mugshots, but they didn't do it on the three guys. I think this one's very telling. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when it hit New Orleans, we were all inundated with images, TV coverage, and all of that. But this was in the same newspaper. So you had 2 white residents who went to a grocery store and got bread and soda. And so the headline said, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. They found it, okay? A young African-American male also went and got food from the grocery store, and the headline was, "A young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store." So when white people were going in grocery stores and getting supplies and food, they found them. But when African-Americans were going into grocery stores and getting supplies and food, they were looting a grocery store. So when you read that, you may not have even noticed there was a difference in the coverage reported. But when your brain is absorbing that and you're inundated with that image and that negative message, your brain automatically is going to start attributing African-American behavior, looting, white people behavior, finding, okay? In 2014, Today Show host Matt Lauer asked Mary Barra, CEO of General Motors, if she could be a good mother and an effective CEO of a major company. I don't think Matt Lauer would have asked a male CEO if he felt he could be a good father and effective CEO of a major company. He probably was not even aware, of that difference. Probably didn't even think, I shouldn't ask this if I'm not going to ask everybody of their ability to be a good parent and be an effective CEO of a major company. Look at some examples. So when you look at the default as being white male, they comprise 33% of the population, but yet they hold 80% of the tenured positions in higher education, 80% of the House of Representatives, 80 to 85% of the U.S. Senate, 92% of Forbes 400 executive CEO level positions, 90% of public school superintendents, and 99.9% of athletic team owners. The questions we must ask ourselves is like, where are the women? Where are the people of color? If these are due to racism and sexism, who are the culprits? Are these outcomes due to overt racist or sexist attempts? It's not the overt racist or sexist which controls the tools that result in these damaging disparities. It's the implicit biases that creep into all processes, whether it be hiring, business owners, being elected, whatever it may be. Look at the disparity. If white males only comprise 33% of the available population, but they're represented in all these positions at 80% and higher, that's a huge discrepancy. When doctors, they did a study and gave doctors patient histories and asked them to make judgments about heart disease. They were less likely to recommend cardiac catheterization to a black patient, even when their files were statistically identical to white patients. Now, if you ask these cardiologists, would you ever make a medical decision based upon a person's race, they're going to tell you no, and they're going to believe that they would not do that. But when the study occurred, it shows that clearly they were less likely to recommend cardiac catheterization to a black patient. New York Times did a study in 2015, and they put iPods auctioned on eBay, and they randomly varied the color of the hand holding the iPod. So they had a white hand holding an iPod in the picture, and they had a black hand holding the iPod. And what they found that the white hand holding the iPod received 21% more offers than the black hand holding the iPod. Let's take this into the employment arena. So in employment situations, we know that implicit bias can have a great effect when decisions are subjective, okay? The areas of risk can be recruitment, career development, hiring, discipline, selection, any and all employment decisions that have an element of subjectivity. So in 2017, they did a study of Fortune 100 companies, and what they found was more men were named David or Steve than there were female CEOs. So out of the top 100 companies, there's 6 female CEOs, 7 named Steve, and 8 named David. So more men are named David or Steve than there are female CEOs. You all may have heard about this study, Mark of a Criminal Record. So employers in Milwaukee were given a hypothetical situation. They were asked whether they would hire an applicant who was reasonably well qualified for a vacant position but had a recent drug conviction and 18 months in prison. 60% of the employers said they would hire the applicant, okay? This percentage was roughly the same whether the applicant was black or white. Employers said 60% said we would still hire that applicant. But what they didn't know was months before that, both white and black testers with and without drug convictions and criminal records applied for positions with these very same employers, okay? So what they found was that 34% of the whites without a conviction were called back. 17% of the whites with a conviction were called back. 14% of blacks without a conviction were called back, and only 5% of blacks with a conviction were called back. It's a huge disparity, and of course all of it's much less than employers said they would do. 60% that they would. The reality is the most was 34%. But what's really striking to me in this whole scenario is that 14% of blacks without a conviction were called back. It's still lower than the number of whites with a conviction. They would be called back at 17%. And I think that really highlights the bias. Now, if you ask these employers, would you treat a black applicant with a conviction different than you would a white applicant with a conviction? They're going to tell you, no, we wouldn't. But the reality is they do. And, you know, I can't believe in, you know, every employer there's a racist. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is those subjective decisions that are made are influenced by the biases they may not even be aware they have. So I think that really highlights how it can creep into the employment situation. You've probably heard of Emily and Brendan. So Emily, there was a study called Are Emily and Brendan More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? Okay, and it was done by the University of Chicago. So what they did, they mailed in applications, resumes, whatever. And in this case, the employer's decision makers never even laid eyes on the applicants, okay? All they had was their application. And so what happened was when their names sounded more white, if you will, they had names like Neil, Emily, Carrie, Brendan, Sarah, they received 50% more callbacks than the exact same applications with the names changed to be Rashid, Lakeisha, Jamal, Ebony, Latanya. Okay, that's pretty significant in that study. And if you ask those employers, would you make a decision based on how somebody's name sounds, they're going to tell you no, we wouldn't. And we've also seen where neighborhoods indicated maybe by zip codes or areas affected the likelihood of a callback. So applicants living in whiter, more educated, higher income neighborhoods had a higher probability of receiving a job callback generally. So it's interesting to look into that. And, you know, I encourage all of you to go look at these studies and read into them. They're really pretty fascinating, I think. So in this one, which Texas A&M did, they sent 4,000 fake resumes sent to employers in Boston and St. Petersburg for entry-level positions only, all with no more than 10 years experience listed. High school attendance dates were listed. Women 35 to 45 were 43% more likely to get an interview than women 50 to 62. Again, I'm sure if you ask those hiring officials, would you make a hiring decision based on somebody's age, they're going to tell you no, wouldn't do it. But just that 5-year difference, 45 to 50, 43% more got an interview. Joni Hirsch at Vanderbilt University did this study and on skin tone and how it affects immigrant wages. And so she surveyed over 2,000 immigrants, and when she crunched the data, she found that those with the lightest skin tone earned 8 to 15% more than those with the darkest skin tone. One shade lighter had the same effect as an additional year of education. And other factors such as English language proficiency, education, occupation, race, country were considered, but skin tone persisted as the determining factor. So Yale did this in 2012. They sent science professors in biology, chemistry, and science a CV for a lab manager, okay? And they told them that the applicant was promising but not stellar. So in half of the experiments, the applicant was named John, and in the other half, Jennifer. The CVs were identical, okay? Identical. So what they found that on a scale of 1 to 7, John received an average competence score of 4, and Jennifer 3.3. exact same CV. Average starting salary offered to Jennifer was $26,508. The average offered to John was $30,238. Bias had no relation to the professor's age, sex, teaching field, or tenure status. So it was a variety of people, professors, male, female, older, younger, different races, and it still turned out that the exact same CV, if it had a female's name on it instead of a male's name, got offered less pay and was rated less than the male. Again, if you ask those professors, would you do that? Would you rate someone lower because they're female? Would you offer them pay less because they're a female? They're going to tell you. No. I'm sorry, I'm reading this question. I'll get to that in a second. Symphony orchestra study. So you may have heard about this. So years ago, women only comprised about 5% of all symphony orchestra positions, okay? And the top symphony orchestras in the United States, they sought to use objective selection criteria, they advertised opens, they allowed orchestra members to participate in hiring decisions, but still, women comprised less than 5% of those positions. So what they decided to do was to implement blind auditions. And in doing that, they put up a curtain between the judges and the person competing to be on the symphony. And the scores went up for the women competing. But they were still low. And what they figured out, which I thought was interesting, was women typically wear heels or shoes that make a noise. And so even with the curtain up, they could still hear a woman walking to the spot behind the stage to perform, and their brain still processed that it was a woman, but they consciously were not aware of that. So they put carpet down, and you can't hear who's walking onto the stage, and you can't see them. And when they did that, it increased by 50% the probability that a woman would be advanced from certain rounds, and increases several-fold the likelihood that a woman will be selected in the final round. All right, let me see. While the statistics on white versus black applicants, as well as additional data on convicted, no conviction of applicants appears biased, this would also require that the qualifications for white and black, convicted, no conviction, are equivalent, making the only variable race or legal status. Was the variable of qualifications controlled by using the same resumes randomized? Yes, they were. They prepared the resumes, the same background, the same everything. And so the only difference was the difference was race. And it was the same drug conviction, served 18 months. So, yes. So while research has identified over 150 types of bias that we can possess, we're going to look at 5 because we obviously couldn't do 150. But these 5 can impact your employment decisions, and we're going to look at them in the context of hiring, okay? So there's affinity bias, confirmation bias, conformity bias, the halo effect, and the horns effect. So affinity bias, that's the tendency where we have to connect with others who share similar experiences, interests, and backgrounds. Sometimes people call it similarity bias. If a company hires for a culture fit, you know, you might want to, you hear sometimes say, we have a certain culture, we like to have a culture fit. They are likely engaging in affinity bias and are not aware that they're probably doing that. So when a hiring official or team meets someone they like and who they know they'll get along with them, more likely than not, it's because that person shares similar experiences, interests, or backgrounds. If you have an applicant who went to the same college you do, you feel a connection there. If you have an applicant who may be from the same place you're from, you feel that connection and you have an automatic preference. Bias kicks in, and that preference escalates that person, that affinity bias, and that can come out in the subjective hiring decisions we make. So a way that you can avoid affinity bias is you can take note of the similarities shared with the applicant. so you can differentiate between attributes that can cloud your judgment and the concrete skills, experiences, and unique qualities that would contribute to your organization as what I would like to call a cultural addition rather than a culture fit. So take note of those similarities, analyze them, make sure they haven't clouded your judgment, and that you're making that decision based on those concrete skills, qualities, experiences that contribute to your team. Confirmation bias. This is the inclination we have as humans to draw conclusions about a situation or a person based on our own beliefs, desires, and prejudice rather than on unbiased merit. So this can play a harmful role at the beginning of the process when you first review an application or resume and form an initial opinion based on insignificant attributes like a name, like we talked about are Emily and Brendan more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal. This is where this confirmation bias can kick in, where they're from, where they went to school. This opinion can flow to the interview process and steer questions to confirm your initial opinion of the applicant. How to avoid confirmation bias in that process. Every interview will result in a unique conversation, right, based upon that person's background. So it's very important to ask those standardized skill-based questions that provide each applicant with a fair chance to stand out. So you want to have those questions ready. Those off-the-cuff questions are where that subjectivity can come in and can result in confirmation bias. So, put those questions together before an interview and use those questions in every interview. Be consistent and focus on the skill-based, what you need to make an objective decision in hiring rather than a subjective. Conformity bias. This is an interesting thing to me. The tendency we have to act similar to the people around them, regardless of their own personal beliefs, sometimes called peer pressure. So you've probably seen, I don't know, Dateline, somebody did it, where they had a group of people sitting in a waiting room for a doctor's office. And every time this little bell would ring, they had a couple of plants in there. Two people would stand up every time and then sit back down. So then the interesting thing was that every time that happened, more and more people in that waiting room would stand up as well and sit back down. They had no idea why they were doing it, but since a couple of people were doing it and more people were doing it, they decided they had to do it. That's that conformity bias, okay? When a hiring interviewing team gets together to review an application, resume, and other materials and conduct an interview, conformity bias can cause an individual to change their opinion of a candidate to match the opinion of the majority. So let's say you have a hiring team of 6, and 4 people on that hiring team are saying the same thing about an applicant, and studies show that even if the majority is not right, the other 2 people in the room will typically conform to that opinion. And so when that happens, you may miss out on an excellent candidate and a great employee, right? Because opinions become muddled in that group setting. So what can you do to attack that? Before you get your team or hiring officials together to review an applicant, have them all write down and submit their individual opinions separate from one another. So they analyze the information they have and write down, their individual opinion after they've reviewed the documents or after they've done the interview. Then pull the team together and review what everyone wrote down so you and they can hear the impartial opinions that were formed. And you don't have that conformity bias influencing, the opinion stated by one of the hiring people. Halo effect. This is the tendency we have to place another person on a pedestal after learning something impressive about them, right? It can come into play at any stage of the hiring process. You may see an applicant worked at a highly regarded company or graduated from an elite school. But I would like to say if there's anything we've learned from the college admission scandal last year, to not judge a candidate on the merit of their name brand education, right? Just having that name brand education shouldn't put you, in a halo effect there. But it does, and it comes into play in hiring frequently. So how do you avoid that? So you're probably looking, when you're looking at an applicant, you're a hiring official, part of a team, you're looking for something unique that makes that applicant stand out from the rest. When you do this, also consider the candidate without that one shiny attribute and see how their skills, experiences, and personalities compare to the other candidates who may have had more privileges or opportunities, okay? So remove those things that give you the halo, oh, this person is so wonderful, I'm putting them on a pedestal because they went here or they did this or they worked at this company. Because if someone didn't get to go to Harvard and maybe they had to go to a community college, doesn't mean they're not going to be a good employee, right? So look at that. Horns effect. This is the exact opposite of the halo effect. This is where we have the tendency to view another person negatively after learning something unpleasant or negative about them, okay? So the horn effect can cause hiring officials to weed out candidates based on a trait that is averse to them. This could be something as trivial as the candidate worked for a company you don't like, or they displayed a particular quirk or mannerism that you didn't like. These traits can alter your perception of the candidate, even though it's a small factor that may not even be relevant to the position you're hiring for, okay? You may have had an ex-husband or an ex-wife that did a thing, maybe tap their foot constantly, and you have an applicant doing that, and you're not consciously processing that, but your brain triggers that aversion you have to your ex doing that, and that puts a horns effect on the whole process. So how can you avoid that? If you have a negative reaction or feeling, take a moment to figure out exactly where that gut feeling is coming from. It may be something insignificant that shouldn't affect their chances. If there's a team reaction, check with the members of the team to get to the root of their opinions and preferences. Now, are we saying every time you have a negative reaction that it's wrong? No. But it can be, and it can affect your hiring, and it can affect your employment decisions. So take time to figure out, where is that feeling coming from? Why do I have this gut reaction to this person this way? So even though we know that we all have implicit bias, it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. We don't get to say, hey, we can't help it because we don't consciously do this. Our brain is doing this. So therefore, it's not our fault that this happens. That's using implicit bias as an excuse for hurtful or discriminatory behavior. We need to take the time to better understand ourselves through introspection and looking at our biases, as well as increasing our knowledge of others and change our behavior accordingly, okay? How do we counteract implicit bias? First thing, if you haven't gone to Project Implicit and taken any of their tests to discover your implicit biases, I highly encourage you to do so, okay? You answer demographic questions before the test. The entire process takes around 10 minutes. They have various test options you can take. You can take it on race, sexuality, gender, age, weight. There's a number of bias tests you can take. But the bias matters, okay? And when you become aware, I've gone in and taken these tests, and sometimes it's really shocking to get the result that you get, because you think, I don't have this bias, I work for EEOC, I have no biases, I'm there's no way, and you take this test and it reveals the biases to you. It can be quite shocking sometimes, but it's the first step in self-awareness and the first step in overcoming those implicit biases. Some people get really angry. I've had people tell me they were angry because they didn't believe the results of their IAT that showed that maybe they had a bias against their own race or their own gender. And that's really kind of uncomfortable for people sometimes. But it's the first step. Now, I always tell employers, have your people encourage them to take it, right? Your hiring officials, all your employees, please don't ask for the results. Don't do it. You don't want to know the results. It's for them, their self-awareness, all right? And you can't cheat on the test. There's no cheating. It measures your response between good words and images and bad words and images. And if you stop to think about what the correct answer will be, the test is invalidated and you have to start over. So I highly encourage you, if you have not done so, go to Project Implicit and take some of those tests. That's the first step. Personal action, of course, take the IAT. Identify situations in which your biases can impact your behavior. Become aware of your positive stereotypes. Hang out with people who have better attitudes than you. What does that mean? It's like, what does that mean? So you might I have a friend who runs a nonprofit here in Little Rock that works with the homeless. My association with him and his group has changed, reformed my opinions of the homeless. I get to hear stories about the homeless, and it helps me have a better attitude towards homeless people in general. That was one of the things, that was eye-opening for me. Had I just stayed in my own little shell and didn't get involved with this group and didn't know Aaron, I would still harbor those stereotypes and negative thoughts in my brain about homeless people that I would tell you I didn't feel that way. But so when you expose yourself to areas where you know you have a bias, you're making those changes. You're going to slowly mold your brain to rewire to not have that negative impact in your brain. Something as simple as placing a positive images from those different from you in your environment, photographs, art, a screensaver, whatever. A screensaver reflecting a variety of diverse images counters stereotypes, and it rewires your brain. You're not consciously thinking about it, but your brain is. It's accepting those positive images and taking those in and replacing those negative stereotypes and biases that are there. Commit to increasing your knowledge about positive intellectual and heroic figures that are different than you, both historical and contemporary. And engage in constant, meaningful educational programs that directly address implicit biases. There is so much information on the web about implicit bias and things you can do and how you can change. One of the things I tell people is, I'm an Army brat, so I've lived all over and in Thailand as well. I think traveling and seeing other cultures, I think living in different parts of the country changes your whole attitude about a lot of things, and you're less fearful of people who are not like you, and you have more positive images of people that are not like you. And so that's how you combat that on a personal level. Organizational action. Encourage your employees to take the IAT. Don't ask for the results. Establish clear criteria in advance of making decisions, right? So that your bias gets taken out of the decision-making process. Just put those safeguards in there so that you can prepare and identify those areas that have that detrimental impact on your employment decisions. Hold decision makers accountable, including yourself, and scrutinize the criteria to identify whether it unintentionally screens out certain good candidates, okay? Think it through as to whether it unintentionally can screen out a good candidate. Survey every aspect of the employment process, from pre-screening resumes, hiring, promotion, career opportunities, compensation, everything, as well as the performance management process. When you survey employees about, you may say we have this interview process we do, and the people who do the interviews, turn their notes in and stuff, but when you survey your employees and ask them what happened in this interview, how did it go, what was going on, you may learn something different than what is actually being presented. And it allows you to look at those areas that you need to check into and focus on to remove that bias from those subjective decisions. Train leadership and employees. Encourage them to go beyond the classroom of and do self-awareness and to participate in affinity groups or mentoring programs. And conduct ongoing benchmark against best practices when you do that. Offer that to your employees. Encourage them to do that. Include practices to change the culture. Micro affirmations. Look for doors of opportunity. Gestures of including and caring. Listening, giving credit to others. Include all that. Build that into your day-to-day interactions in the workplace. Think about rewarding your employees who engage with affinity groups. And bring out the best in the culture by strengthening diversity. Reward them. Acknowledge and reward those employees striving to strengthen the culture and diversity in the workplace and raise their own self-awareness. And then remind everyone frequently of the importance of recognizing bias and strive for fairness at all times. And if you develop that into your workplace culture, if that's just part of how you do business, you're going to see those subjective decisions that are tainted by implicit biases. You're going to see an improvement in that. So there's a number of tools and resources. I put some of them on here for you. I thought all of these had excellent articles, tools, resources. So you can go. SHRM has some racial equity tools. ADL, Anti-Defamation League, has a great anti-bias tool strategy area. Women's Place has great implicit bias resources. All of those can help you look into this a little bit more. One thing I thought was interesting, there's a gender, and there's several versions, but this one is Decoder CatMat Field. They have a gender decoder for job ads. So you write out an ad and you cut it and paste it and stick it in there, and it will tell you if your job has those words in it that are feminine coded or masculine coded, so that you can correct that job advertisement so it is gender neutral, which is pretty interesting, I think. So I've played around with it. I've typed up some stuff and played around with it, and it's really kind of cool what it tells you. So I encourage you to go try it out. It doesn't cost anything to do it. And some of the feminine coded words they talk about: support, responsible, understanding, responsive. Those generate a female attribute. When people read that, it's more geared to women. And then the masculine coded words are analytics, lead, ambitious, I think objectively, independently. So if I'm reading a job ad and I'm reading it and it's full of masculine coded words, the studies show that as a woman, I don't analyze it and oh, well, they want a man for this position, because it's not written that way. But my brain associates those words with masculinity, and I might say, well, I'm not qualified for this job. I can't do this job. So it's really kind of cool, and I encourage you to go check it out and play with it, just to see. Check your job ads. Maybe even check your position descriptions that you have. Paste that in there and see what it tells you. So I'd like to kind of end this with, I like to remind people to be careful of stereotypes, because when you look at this, only one of these individuals is a convicted felon. And it's not Ice Cube the rapper. It's Martha Stewart. So do we have any questions or comments or anything before we finish this up?
All righty. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, Deb. I'm going to open up the floor for the audience. I'm going to unmute the audience right now. If you have something going on in the background, I ask that you mute yourselves back, but I've opened it up so that you may pose a question. Just ask that you *6 and mute yourself back once you're done. Before I see that we've got a question in the chat. Before posing that question, I want to present to you one that I received via email during the session. And the question is affinity bias the same with face-to-face interviews as it is with telephone interviews?
Yes, I think it can be. If there's something that you connect to on the affinity, can you hear?
Yeah.
Yes, if you know you have a similar experience, interest, or background, even if you're doing it by phone or in person, you're still going to latch onto that. Your brain is going to latch onto that, and you're going to feel that affinity, that connection with that person. Yes. And John Van Santen had an interesting comment in the conversation, and you can probably read it, but he's talking about the most prevalent bias he has seen is the tailoring of job announcements to a specific desired individual who is fundamentally pre-selected for the position. Yes, that does happen. And I agree. He says, wouldn't a better way to do this, to avoid this, is not to write job-specific announcements, but rather skills required? Yes, I agree. Focus on those skills that are required for the position and don't tailor it to a particular person. And yes, it would take a concerted effort by hiring managers and HR staff. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions from the audience for Deb? Feel free to type them into the chat or unmute your phone if it's not already unmuted. Oh, I do see one. Did you see John Sims' question here in the chat, Deb?
Oh, I'm looking. I'm reading it now.
Mm-hmm.
Huh, interesting. You know, John, I don't know if there's a successful example, but I really like that question. Now I'm going to go look. When I finish this, I'm going to go look and see if I can find something with the use of artificial intelligence. That's a great question, and I'm sorry I don't have an example to share with you, but as soon as I get off this, I'm going to go look and see if I can find something, because that's a really cool way to look at that. Do you know of any, John?
Let's share the question with everyone. We have some folks that have joined by phone. And the question that was posed is, have there been any successful examples of the use of artificial intelligence in the federal sector to reduce implicit bias and other biases? John, if you're able to unmute. He may not be able to unmute. Yeah. Okay. But that is a great question. That's something I'd like to look into as well. Yeah. That'd be interesting to learn. Yes.
Although there are some people who feel that AI has the potential to also contain bias.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Deb. This is Marge, and thank you so much for your presentation and the examples. I think they're really insightful. My question has to do with bias at the recruitment stage. And when we're out recruiting, we are underrepresented with women and certain groups, whether they be Hispanic or African American students. When we go out and recruit, do you think that, I'm interested in your thoughts, if we go to campuses and say that we are an agency that wants a diverse population, we do want more women, more Hispanics, more African Americans students applying for positions because they're really good careers that you can have with us. But I think at times there's a little pushback where, on the recruitment side, they may say, no, you cannot say that. That you have to treat everybody equally. And although I think that there are merit principles that need to be considered at the hiring phase, I think when you're at the recruitment phase, I think it's okay for us to state that we want a more diverse population. So just interested in your thoughts on bias or on that approach.
I agree with you. I think it's okay to say we want a diverse workforce. We want a diverse workforce. And if you're a federal contractor, some federal contractors have AAPs where they have to target to increase certain
Mm-hmm.
populations, right?
Right.
So I think, in the recruitment process, I think it's fine to do that. I
Okay.
think where people sometimes get in trouble, and we've seen it, we had a police department that was trying to combat years of not hiring African Americans as police officers. So then they just made a blanket statement of, we're only going to hire black officers for our next 6 positions. Well, obviously,
right.
that wasn't the correct
Right.
way to approach that.
Right.
But, companies and agencies can make those efforts to increase the participation rate of various segments of the population in their workforce, and a lot of companies do that. I think it's perfectly fine, and I think people need to look at their recruitment process and the avenues they're using. They may not even be thinking about it. We're going to put this advertisement out, but you may also need to target some ethnic media and things like that to try to increase your pool of applicants. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing. And this was just timely, and so I just wanted to get your thoughts. So thank you. That's exactly what we're working on.
Okay. Yeah, John, I agree. I've heard that too. I'm not well versed on it. I know you are more versed on the big data and all of that than I am. But it's true. That is one of the concerns they have, is that the human biases can still seep into the artificial intelligence tools that are used.
All righty. Do we have any additional questions or comments on this topic? Well, we've got Deb here. We were very fortunate to have Deb. Oh, thanks so much for sharing your contact information, Deb. For those that are not able to see the slides, Deb is the EEOC Outreach and Education Manager at the Memphis District Office. And her email address is Deborah, DEBRA, Finney, FINNEY, at EEOC.gov. And she's kindly provided her phone number as well, 501-324-6372. Again, that's 501-324-6372. Again, these slides will be provided to all who participated today. So you'll if you didn't catch that information, you'll have her contact information whenever I send out the slides to everyone. Again, we're going to open it up and see if we've got any more questions or comments for Deb before we close out today's session.
Hello, this is Glenda Crunk calling from MCOM Europe.
Thanks so much, Glenda. I didn't know you were that far away joining us. Glad that you could join us.
I wanted to share a best practice that a manager that I had encountered several years ago when I was working in Atlanta. What he would do when he would send out requests for hires, he would ask the HR people to cut off the top of the resumes that indicated their names. And he didn't want to see the resumes with the names. And he wanted them to screen the resumes, then send him the resumes without the names at the top of the resumes, so he could get a true assessment, he and his team could get a true assessment of the knowledge, skills, etc., of the people that were applying for the positions. And what he noticed, he started getting a more diverse population.
Exactly. Yeah. That's one of the suggestions that's made all the time, is to remove the names from the applications. But you can still run into issues. What if somebody went to an HBCU and that's listed, and that can still have an impact, unconsciously have an impact. HBCU, if you don't know, is the Historical Black College and University. I read a couple of articles last year that I thought were really interesting, is that a lot of applicants are what they're calling whitewashing their applications. So one young lady went to an HBCU and then got her post degree at another institution. So she took the HBCU off of her application, just took it off. Some people code their name different. Like an example, say my name's Jamal Broadway, and on my application I just put J Broadway, something like that. And it's, it's interesting that people feel, well, and they do it because, they have reason. There was the case we had against Target, and I can say it because it was litigation. They were interviewing people via phone for a management program, and the number of African Americans was so statistically low that it was just talking to them on the phone impacted the decision of whether or not someone got into the program. And you ask them, they swore up and down, we did not make any decisions based on the race of a person. But when you looked at the numbers that they interviewed, the one thing was, the phone interview, because they were not interviewing these people in person. So it's really interesting how bias can creep in so many different areas of the process.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments for Deb? This has been a great session. I did post the link for the implicit bias testing at Harvard University in the chat, and again, it is also in the slides that will be provided to all. And I agree with Deb. It's very eye-opening. I think a lot of times we think everybody else has these biases and we don't. And maybe if we even realize that we do, we don't realize to the extent that we do. So thank you, Deb, for sharing that information with us.
And I periodically go back and take the test again just to see if I've improved,
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great idea. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, it's just part of the self-awareness and trying to reprogram and change that aspect. So I encourage people to do it, on a regular basis, just to see if you've, improved.
That's a great suggestion. Great suggestion.
All right, sweetie, mommy has to go.
All righty.
Mommy has to go to the gym. I'll be right back.
Okay. All righty. Do we have any further questions or comments for Deb? All righty. If we don't, I just wanted to let you know that before we close out with a thank you to Deb, just want to let you know that First Fridays with OFO next month in March, we're going to have the OFOs reporting on the federal IT worker and their experience. That's going to be on March 6th, 2020. And on April 3rd, we're going to have a compliance overview, best practices, with a representative from the Office of Federal Operations. In May, per the request that we received when we had our open session, asking for topics that you wanted reviewed, someone requested to have Rubin T versus FBI, a case involving 508 compliance and accommodation requests, have a case review of that. So we'll have one of our OFO attorneys on, Office of Federal Operations attorneys on to do a review of that particular case and open the floor for questions as well. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, Deb, for presenting today. It's always awesome when you get an opportunity to hear Deb. Again, I invite everyone to come out to our Excel conference August 4th through the 6th in New Orleans, Louisiana this year. We will have registration open pretty soon, within the next week or two. Deb presents a few times at the conference, and it's just a really great opportunity, not only for networking, but to hear from subject matter experts from the EEOC and also from various firms and other EEO practitioners on topics of interest to you as an EEO professional. Again, thank you so much for joining us for First Fridays. I wish everyone a very safe and happy weekend, and we'll see you back here at the first Friday of March. Thanks. Thanks again, Deb.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.